Thank you. I trust you can all hear me. Yes. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to have been invited to Berlin and to speak in this lovely venue. I see some people are standing. I hope everyone got in who wanted to get in. But I wanted to say, for those who couldn't make it in, this event, I'm quite sure, is, like all events in Berlin, being recorded by the NSA. And so if we wanted to, we could just go around the corner to the American Embassy and probably listen to it in much greater comfort over there. So I wanted to give you that option if you so desired. I wanted to talk about one of the chapters in my book, which is a chapter about Northern Ireland. And it's the story about a curfew that the British imposed on a particular neighborhood in Belfast called the Lower Falls. And over the course of a weekend, very early on in the troubles in Northern Ireland, the British Army moved in and banished everyone to their homes and searched every house and put a lockdown on the neighborhood until a Sunday morning when a group of women, Catholic women from a neighborhood up the hill, grew so outraged at what they had seen that they marched down the hill towards the Lower Falls, arm in arm, thousands of them singing, "We shall overcome." And the British troops who were manning the barricades saw this avalanche of women approaching them and scattered. And the women liberated the neighborhood. And this event is seen by many to be one of the crucial early turning points in the insurgency in Northern Ireland, the moment at which the Catholics of Belfast and Northern Ireland believed they could successfully confront the Americans, or the British. And the question, sorry, I'm so used to referring to Americans as the bogeyman in every scenario that. So the question is that I'm interested in is, why would they do that? What on earth would motivate a group of people without any obvious power, weapons, authority, to go up against a major army, right? And that's the question I want to talk about this evening, but I don't want to talk too much more about that story from the book because I don't want to diminish your incentive to read the book. So what I thought I would do is approach this topic by telling you a very different story, which I think is another very useful way of getting at this central question of why do people rebel? And that story has to do with a very remarkable woman named Alva Vanderbilt. And Alva Vanderbilt, I think, is one of the great unsung heroes of the 20th century. And she plays an incredibly crucial role in one of the most important political campaigns of the 20th century. And the thing that's interesting about Alva Vanderbilt is there is almost nothing about her on paper that would predict why she played such an incredibly crucial role in American politics in her era. So by understanding what motivated this most unlikely of people to take that role, I hope maybe we can shed some light on what happened in places like Northern Ireland. Alva Vanderbilt was born in the mid-18th century in Alabama. She was the daughter of a fairly well-to-do cotton merchant in Alabama. And when she was quite young, her family moved to New York City. And the simplest way to describe Alva at that age and throughout her life is that she was a force of nature. She was this never more than 5 feet, and she had long hair down to the almost to her knees, which would turn gray by the time she was in her late 20s. And she had this very sharp, almost pinch face that one of her friends, intending to be nice, once described her as looking like a Pekingese. But she was this kind of overpowering, egotistical, controlling, megalomaniacal person whose favorite thing in the world was to pick fights with other people. She was the most disagreeable person you could imagine. And if she couldn't find a fight to pick, she would create a fight and then pick it. She was that kind of person. And she comes of age in New York City, and she realizes that if she is going to accomplish all of the grand designs she has on her life, then she really has to marry somebody with money. And so she searches through the upper crust of Manhattan society, and her eye lands on a young man named Willie Vanderbilt, who is this charming, spoilt, handsome playboy who just happens to be the grandson of the wealthiest man in the United States, Cornelius Vanderbilt. And she learns that Willie Vanderbilt is both single and about to go to a spa in Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. And so she gets on a train and she follows him down there. And one night at dinner in the spa, she descends the great staircase dressed in some outlandish costume. And Willie lays eyes on her, and he is absolutely mesmerized. And so she sits herself down next to him, and she lies about her age, and she charms him. And in a very short period of time, they are married. And whereupon she produces him a daughter named Consuelo and 2 sons, and then sets out on a course to become the greatest conspicuous consumer in the history of conspicuous consumption. And all of us who have lived through the 21st century know that the competition for that title is considerable. So the first thing she does is she buys 800 acres in Long Island, and she constructs for her and her family this enormous country house. And then she goes into Manhattan, and she buys an entire city block on the corner of 51st Street and Fifth Avenue, and she constructs a French-style chateau, which cost in the 1890s $3 million, which translates to about several $100 million in today's money. To give you a sense of what it's like, I'm going to quote to you from a passage about this mansion that was in one of the many books that have been written on the real estate holdings of Alva Vanderbilt, all of which fall into the category of what might be called real estate pornography. So this is a description of what the house was like. Everywhere was everything: walls of red African marble, of stamped leather, walls hung with blue silk brocade, with red velvet embroidered with leaves, flowers, and butterflies, enriched with cut crystal and precious stones, ceilings of mahogany, of bronze, of colored glass, of bamboo, wainscoting of rosewood inlaid with mother of pearl and brass, ebony inlaid with ivory, polished ebony inlaid with satinwood, and Grecian, Oriental, Elizabethan, English, Renaissance, French, and Victorian touches in crowded rooms bursting with bronze, stained glass, marble, and mosaics. Give you a sense. Then she decides she wants a yacht, and not just any yacht, but rather the largest yacht ever built to that point, 285 feet. It's so large that when once her family was cruising off the coast of Turkey, and the Turkish Navy mistook it for an enemy cruiser and fired 3 shots across its bow, and she calls this yacht the Alva, of course, yes. Then she decides she wants a country cottage in Newport, Rhode Island, and I won't go into details on that except to say that she was, during the construction of this cottage, forced to build a special derrick in Rhode Island Harbor, in Newport Harbor, because she was importing 500,000 cubic feet of Italian marble just for the facade. So now she has the country house and the yacht and the city house and the cottage, and her attention falls to her daughter Consuelo. Now, her daughter is this very shy girl, but Alva has always had the highest of expectations for her. She makes sure she has access to all of the strictest and most brilliant of tutors, and she instructs her to only speak French to her family members, and each Friday night she is required to recite a poem in German to her family, and she's required to wear, at the same time, to wear a corset with one of those metal rods up her back and across her shoulders so that her posture is absolutely perfect. And as Consuelo enters adolescence, Alva gets it in her head that what she really wants to do is to marry her daughter off into English royalty. Now, there's no mystery as to where she gets this idea, because this was a very common practice at the time for the wealthy daughters of American millionaires to be married off to the penurious sons of the English aristocracy. In fact, this was so common that there was a term for it. It was referred to as cash for class. And Alva, though, in typical fashion, sets her sights on the single most eligible penurious son of the English aristocracy, who is 23-year-old Charles John Richard Spencer Churchill, otherwise known as Sonny, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, the first cousin of Winston Churchill, the lineal ancestor of Princess Diana, and the heir to Blenheim Palace, which then as now was one of the largest public homes in the world, a place so large it made Alva's French chateau on 51st and 5th Avenue look like a ranch-style bungalow. Well, Alva learns that Blenheim Palace is falling apart and the Duke doesn't have the money to fix it. And the instant she hears that, she realizes he will make the perfect match for her daughter. Now, there are two problems with this idea. The first is that the Duke of Marlborough, otherwise known as Sonny, is not in fact Sonny. His father was considered to be one of the least pleasant men in the 19th century English aristocracy, which, if you know anything about the 19th century English aristocracy, is saying something. He is best known for selling off 18 paintings by Rubens, 2 Rembrandts, 1 Bruegel, 8 Van Dycks, and a couple of Titians in order to finance certain eccentric projects in his backyard. Sonny's mother was known as Goosey, and she was very beautiful and also famously very stupid. And she was known for a series of practical jokes, which are best described, I think, in the psychoanalytic sense as deeply passive-aggressive acts, which consist of things like placing ink pots on the top of doorways so that when her guests would go through the door to their room, the ink would fall on their head. Also once famously, she placed a pink baby doll under the silver dish for her husband's breakfast just after her husband's mistress had given birth to his son. You never quite recover from parents like this, and Sonny, and Sonny did not. He was not a very pleasant person. Consuelo once wrote of him, his hands, which he used in a fastidious manner, were well-shaped, and he seemed inordinately proud of them. And I mention that because over the course of Consuelo's life, during which she wrote many, many, many thousands of words, that is the nicest thing she ever said about Sonny. The only other fact worth mentioning about Sonny is that his second wife, Emily Deacon, used to sleep with a revolver by her pillow in case her husband should come to her in the middle of the night. So that's the first problem with Sonny. The second problem is that Consuelo is in love with someone else. She has fallen for a young man named Winthrop Rutherford, who is this handsome, charming son of a very prominent New York City family, and they are in love. He is everything Sonny is not. He is a brilliant athlete, a great dancer, incredibly debonair, a perfect dresser. On her 18th birthday, she receives a rose, and there's no note attached, but she knows exactly who it's from. It's from this man she has given her heart to. And not long afterwards, she goes on a bicycle trip with Winthrop, and as they're going down Riverside Drive in Manhattan, which curves like this, they come to the point of a curve, and they speed up so they can get away from Alva, who is, of course, riding along. And they speed up, and as they round the curve and are out of sight of Alva, Wintry, as he's known, turns to Consuelo and says, "Will you marry me?" And she says, "I will." And Alva, of course, realizes something is up, and she pedals as fast as her little legs can carry her, and she catches up with him, and she looks at Wintry in the eye and looks at her daughter, and she realizes what's up. And she immediately takes her daughter and whisks her off to Paris and keeps her in this giant mansion. And Wintry, brokenhearted, comes to Paris to see his beloved, and Alva posts a guard by the door, so Wintry cannot see Consuelo. And then Alva takes Consuelo to the cottage in Rhode Island, and once again, Wintry comes, but Alva keeps Consuelo locked up like Rapunzel in the castle. And finally, Consuelo has had enough, and she climbs the opulent marble staircase to her mother's bedroom, which is this enormous room festooned with cherubs holding shields with the letter A, of course, on them. And Consuelo confronts Alva and says, "You can't do this to me. I have the right to marry the man I love." And Alva stands up to her daughter and says, "Absolutely not. You will be a duchess." And Consuelo pulls herself up and says no, and she confronts her mother. And at that point, Alva absolutely loses it because no one ever confronts Alva. And she goes off into a rage, and she calls Wintry every name in the book. And she says that if Consuelo goes ahead and ruins her life by marrying Wintry, she will shoot him on sight. And Consuelo realizes that is not an idle threat coming from her mother. And she slinks off to her room, and the next morning there is deadly silence throughout the house, and there's a knock on Consuelo's door, and the doctor has been called. And he says to Consuelo, "Your mother is very ill. She has had a heart attack. And if you are to cross her ever again, I'm afraid it will be fatal." And Consuelo realizes there's no hope. She's got no chance. There is nothing to be done but to concede to her mother's wishes. And so on November 6th, 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt is married to Sonny Churchill in one of what may, to this day, be the grandest wedding New York City ever witnessed. The people line up for 30 blocks, 4 and 5 rows deep on Fifth Avenue. And every famous person in the country is invited to the wedding. And there are carriages running for miles. And there are policemen keeping people at bay. And Alva has hired 80 decorators to fill St. Thomas's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue with flowers. And she marches up the aisle in this extraordinary blue satin dress with a border of Russian sable, flanked by her 2 young sons. And she stands at the altar proudly, waiting for the arrival of her daughter. And she waits and waits. First 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, then 20 minutes. And Consuelo doesn't show up. Why? Because she is weeping inconsolably in the arms of her father back at the house. And finally they pull Consuelo together and they clean her up and they bring her to the church and they take her up the aisle, and the priest pronounces them man and wife, and Alva whisks them back into the vestry, and the marriage contract is signed, which promises Sonny $2.5 million up front. That is several $100 million up front, and an allowance of $100,000 a year for life, regardless what happens to his marriage. And the newlyweds get into a carriage and they go off down Fifth Avenue, and Sonny coldly turns to Consuelo and says, "You have 2 responsibilities. 1, to fix my house, and 2, to bear me an heir." And back at the church in an upstairs window, Alva is watching them go, and a tear comes to her eye, because this little girl from a moderately well-to-do family off in the sticks of Alabama is now the mother of a duchess. It is the moment of her greatest triumph, or so she thinks, because things will shortly get complicated. Now, you can see, I think, why I have described Alva as an unlikely radical, because people who have enormous houses and marry their children off into royalty and buy extravagant dresses and put on extravagant parties are not the normal candidates for radicalism. It would be as if we were to hear that one of the Kardashian sisters had gone off and joined Hamas. It's not a likely outcome. So how do we account for it? What is it that would cause someone not otherwise disposed to be rebellious to become rebellious? Well, the standard answer that's been given for many years is the notion of deterrence, which says that people rebel when they are in a situation where the costs of rebellion are less than the benefits of rebellion. In other words, that people do a kind of simple weighing of the pros and cons, and if there is more to be gained by rising up in protest, they will protest, and if there isn't, they won't. Right? Now, that notion has been absolutely at the core of all kinds of anti-insurgent strategies and law and order strategies for years and years and years. The problem with it is that there are an enormous number of instances where that theory does not predict human behavior. So for example, here's a good one. Think about taxes. If you look at the likelihood of people from different countries being honest on tax day, paying their taxes, what you discover is that throughout the Western world, there are huge variations. Enormous numbers of Greeks aren't honest on tax day. By contrast, Americans are incredibly honest on tax day. Americans have the lowest rate of tax cheating in the world. Okay? So the question is, why? What causes this difference? Well, deterrence theory would say that must be because the costs of cheating on your taxes in America are really high, and the costs of cheating on your taxes in Greece are really low. Well, is that true? The answer is no. If you look in America, you will discover the costs of cheating on your taxes are actually really, really low. They are among the lowest in the Western world. The IRS is one of the least punitive bodies of any tax-gathering agency in the West. If they catch you cheating, most of the time, all they require you to do is to pay back what you owe along with a relatively modest penalty. People rarely go to jail, right? And on top of that, the percentage of taxpayers whose returns are audited by the American tax authorities is incredibly small. Your odds of getting caught if you cheat on your taxes in America are like that. Right? So the question is, why do Americans pay their taxes then? Why are they honest? Well, in response to this puzzle, a number of theorists have said, you know what, it's not about deterrence. Rather, it's more fundamentally, people will obey the law as a function of legitimacy. They will obey authority when they believe authority is behaving in a legitimate manner, and they will rebel when they believe that authority is behaving in an illegitimate manner. Now, what does legitimacy mean? Well, it means three things, roughly. One is that we believe a system is legitimate when we're treated with respect, when we believe that if we are wronged, we can stand up and speak up and be heard. The second component of legitimacy is fairness. We believe a system is legitimate when we are treated the same as our neighbors, when there aren't clear differences in how people are treated under the law. And thirdly, we believe a system is legitimate when it's trustworthy, when the way the system is today is a reasonable approximation of the way it will be tomorrow, when there isn't some arbitrary system that changes the rules every 5 minutes. So when you look at that idea of legitimacy, it turns out it explains tax paying really well. Why do Americans pay their taxes even though the penalties for cheating are so low? Because they believe their system is legitimate. Right? In America, is the American system, tax system, respectful? If you complain about your taxes, will you be heard? Absolutely. There's an entire American party devoted to listening to people's complaints about their taxes, right? Is the system fair? Well, with some small exceptions, the way that it treats people who have hedge funds, for example, but we'll leave that aside. In the main, the American system is pretty fair. And is it trustworthy? That is to say, do you have an expectation the way it looks today is a good approximation of the way it looks tomorrow? The answer is yes. It is a highly trustworthy system. Americans pay their taxes because their tax system conforms with our notions of legitimacy. By contrast, what happens in Greece? Does the Greek tax system meet those three criteria? Absolutely not, right? It's not fair, it's not respectful, and it certainly isn't trustworthy. And what happens in situations where there is no legitimacy? Well, people don't pay their taxes. They rebel. They stand up and become defiant. Nothing serves as a greater engine of defiance than the condition of being denied those three things: respect, fairness, and trustworthiness. Which brings us back to Alva. So here we have this woman who was going around building enormous houses and putting on grand parties and buying extravagant dresses. She doesn't sound like someone who is a suitable candidate for radicalism. But if you look closely at her life and peek below the surface, what you discover is that she occupies an incredibly narrow and oppressive world. She belongs to late 19th century New York society, and late 19th century New York society is not a pleasant place for a woman. You know, you can't work, you can't get an education, you can't vote, you can't speak up and be heard on any public matter. You are expected to keep up respectful appearances, stay at home, and manage your family and put on parties, right? Men, meanwhile, can do whatever they wish. They can get an education, they can run for public office, they can speak up and be heard, they can start businesses, they can participate to the fullest extent they want in every aspect of society. But if you look at the divorce laws in the 19th century in America, a woman can only divorce her husband if she proves both cruelty and infidelity. A man can divorce his wife merely on a suspicion of infidelity. Right? Even there, this is fundamental difference. A man with wealth could satisfy every one of his whims, and the men of wealth in that society did. They would go off on J.P. Morgan's yacht for 2- and 3-day parties with whole groups of call girls, and they would have mistresses in town who they would see at their leisure, and they would stay at their clubs whenever they wished. Though women, meanwhile, were required to stay at home. Right? Now, Willie Vanderbilt, Alva's husband, is no exception. That's exactly what he's like. He's a playboy. He doesn't work for a living. What he does is he has inherited this gigantic fortune, and he goes and he has a good time. And he has one affair after another, all the while Alva is required to stay at home and play this dutiful wife. She would later describe the years leading up to Consuelo's wedding as the most unhappy of her life. She and Willie are starting to argue, and Willie's infidelities are getting to the point where she feels humiliated. And finally, in a desperate attempt to save her marriage, she suggests that the whole family go on a cruise to Paris, and they go off and they spend a few weeks in Paris, but things don't get better, they get worse. The first thing that Willie does is he has an affair with Alva's best friend, a very public affair. And then on top of that, he has a second affair with one of the most notorious high-class prostitutes in all of Paris, a woman named Nellie Neustrater. And Alva is once again doubly humiliated. And later in her life, Alva will write her memoirs, and there's this incredibly poignant line where she describes what it meant to be a woman in that era. And she says, "It was considered religious, dignified, and correct for the wife to withdraw into the shadows while her husband paid the family respects to the sunshine." And then she writes, and this is the line that I find most heartbreaking, "She, a wife, was supposed to get her sunlight by proxy through her husband." And I think that phrase, sunlight by proxy, helps to put a lot of Alva's behavior in perspective. So here we have this clearly brilliant, ambitious, driven woman. And in today's world, she would be out in the business world, right? She would have started a company. She would be running for public office. She would do something on a grand scale. But in 1900 or in the 1890s, all of those things are denied to her. So what does she do? Well, she builds enormous houses, right? Now, in retrospect, that looks like this crass act of conspicuous consumption. But remember, that's a very, I think, narrow and uncharitable reading of her behavior. This is this woman who needs a challenge, and her society gives her only one outlet for her enormous energies, and that is to build these great houses, right? That looks like an act of conspicuous consumption. It is, in fact, a symbol of frustration. It also, I think, makes sense of her seemingly inexcusable behavior over Wintry. Alva loved her daughter. She had paid enormous attention to her daughter's education. She wanted to produce an independent, intelligent, educated woman of the world. She wanted to produce a woman who had the same spirit that she had. And she looks at Wintry. What does she see? Well, at the time that Wintry is pursuing Consuelo, Wintry is 33 and Consuelo is 18. He spends his days playing polo and golf at the Newport Country Club. When he dies, his obituary writer works overtime trying to find something interesting to say about Wintry. And the best he can come up with is that Wintry's dog kennels were known the county over. The county over. When he couldn't marry Consuelo, you know what Wintry did? He simply found himself another young, rich heiress. And when that young, rich heiress died prematurely, he found himself another young, rich heiress. If I might paraphrase the immortal couplet of Mr. Kanye West, I ain't saying he's a gold digger, but I ain't seen it with no broke nigga, right? When Alva looks at him, she sees another version of the man she married, right? Another idle, rich, decadent philanderer who would sentence her daughter to a lifetime of misery and uselessness. By contrast, what does the Duke of Marlborough represent? Well, he's a miserable guy, yes, but he's a miserable guy in another country, away from this constricting environment in New York society, and in a place where women played a very different role. And if she married him, she would be the Duchess of Marlborough, and she would have a position in society that would allow her to speak up and be heard, allow her to participate in public life, allow her to have a platform where the rest of the world would take her seriously. Now, to our modern ear, that sounds like a very cynical calculation, because Consuelo was in love with Wintry, and we think you ought to be able to marry for love. But to Alva, in the late 19th century, when women were little more than property of their husbands, love was a luxury she felt her daughter could not afford. Her daughter had a real mind and a real spirit, and Alva was not going to let her daughter squander her life in the same way that she, Alva, felt her own life had been squandered. So what does she do? Well, the first thing that Alva does is that she kicks Willie out of the house. She says, I want a divorce. Now, this is unheard of in that time and place. It's a scandal. Every tabloid in the country writes about it. She's vilified and cast out of society. She goes to her church, where she's been going for 20 years and where she thought she was surrounded by her friends. And when people hear that she's divorcing Willie, they turn their backs to her and pretend they don't know who she is, right? And the next thing, what's the next thing she does? Well, the next thing she does is she pulls herself up to her full 4'10", and she tells her daughter that she can't throw her life away by marrying Wintry Rutherford, right? And then she marches up the aisle of the church, flanked by her sons, and she stands there for 10 and 15 and 20 minutes, completely humiliated, with every eye in the church upon her, and she knows where her daughter is. She knows her daughter is at home, weeping inconsolably into her father's arms, because she's asked her daughter to do something that is seemingly impossible, to turn her back on someone that she loves. Right? Those tears that come into Alva's eyes when her daughter pulls away are not tears of triumph. They're they're tragic tears, right? She's someone who's been forced to make two incredibly difficult, deeply courageous choices. One is to get rid of her husband because he has humiliated her. And the second is to alienate her daughter, to send her daughter away in order to save her. Right? Now, under normal circumstances, we would expect people in those, faced with those kinds of impossibly difficult decisions, to fold, to say it's not worth it. Right? But Alva doesn't do that. And why is that? Because she does not accept society's judgment of her as legitimate. Right? She does not believe that she has been treated with respect. She does not believe she has been treated fairly. She does not believe the system she operates in is trustworthy. Alva, at that moment, is in the position that all radicals are at the moment of their transformation, and that is that she's angry. Now, I said at the beginning that one of the things I wanted to do was to understand in a bit more deeper way what happened in Northern Ireland, why the British presence there went so deeply awry. And I think that the simplest way to describe what happened in Northern Ireland is the British did not understand this principle of legitimacy. Right? They didn't appreciate the same lesson that Alva teaches us. You know, the British came to Northern Ireland in 1969 with the very best of intentions. Catholic and Protestant were at each other's throats. The country was in flames. There were riots everywhere. And the British stepped in to act as peacekeepers, to keep these two warring factions apart. And in the beginning, they were welcomed with open arms by both sides. Right? But that doesn't last. And it doesn't last because they have a fundamentally false misconception about the role they ought to play in that country. The general who leads the British effort in Northern Ireland is a guy named Ian Freeland, who was a general of the old school, that straight back and the square jaw and the piercing blue eyes. And he was someone who very clearly lay down the law when he arrived. The first thing he said is, the army's patience is not inexhaustible. We will meet force with force, right? He's a believer in deterrence. He thinks that if people are rebelling, the problem is the costs of rebelling are not high enough. And the first thing he does is raise the costs of rebellion. So he hears about, in this little neighborhood called the Lower Falls, he gets a tip that there are some weapons hidden in a house. And what does he do? He immediately sends a group of soldiers and policemen to that house. And they search it, and sure enough, they find weapons. And by the time they come out after the search, a group of youth have gathered, and they're really angry. They don't like the idea the army just descends on their neighborhood. And they start throwing stones at the soldiers and the police officers. But instead of leaving, which is what they should have done, the soldiers and the policemen are there to enforce Freeland's notion about getting tough. So they stand and they fight, and they lob tear gas grenades into the crowd. But that only serves to make the crowd angrier and angrier and angrier. And the riot grows and it spreads over the whole neighborhood. And Freeland looks at this and says, enough. And he brings in the helicopters and he says to everyone, get back into your homes. If I see you on the street, I'll shoot you. And he floods the neighborhood, tiny neighborhood with 3,000 troops. And over the course of that night and into the morning, he searches every single house from top to bottom and confiscates everything that looks even remotely illegal. And in the morning, he drives through the neighborhood in a flatbed truck, and the streets are absolutely deserted. And he thinks that what he has done is that he has solved the problem in Northern Ireland. He has shown for the first time that rebellion will be met with immediate force. And he really and truly believes that he will be home by Christmas, he and all of his troops. But of course, he's not home by Christmas. The British are there for another 30 years, right? And why? Well, think of it from the perspective of those in the Lower Falls. Were they treated with respect? Did the Catholics of Belfast believe that if they were wronged, they could stand up and be heard? No. That was the whole problem in Northern Ireland. The Catholics were disenfranchised, and there was no way for them to be heard. Did they believe they would be treated with fairness? That they would be treated under the law the same way as the Protestants? No, that was the whole problem in Northern Ireland, right? Even the police force, which Freeland was using to crack down on the rioting in the Lower Falls, was 95% Protestant. Do you think the people in the Lower Falls thought they were getting a fair shake from a police force that was composed almost entirely from the ranks of their enemies? During the riots of the previous summer, the Protestant militants had come up to the police and asked to borrow their weapons, right? That's how deeply embedded those two sides were. And did they think that the system was trustworthy? No. They went from living in a democracy one day to living under martial law the next. So after 2 days of that curfew, the people the women up the road in this other Catholic neighborhood see and say, this can't go on. This is an outrage. And they band together, thousands of them, and they sing, "We Shall Overcome," and they link arms, and they march down the hill, and the British troops scatter, and that is the beginning of the insurgency in Northern Ireland. And you can see why people have pointed to that moment as being so crucial. Because normally, women do not march on armed soldiers. Women with children at home and responsibilities and no training whatsoever in the military arts do not take on mighty forces, right? But they do if they've been denied legitimacy. Right? Because what happens to people who have been denied legitimacy? They get angry. And one of the mistakes that people in authority always make is that they forget what a powerful and unstoppable force that kind of anger can be. So the spark that ends up setting off the powder keg that is Alva Vanderbilt turns out to be her daughter, Consuelo. Consuelo's marriage to Sonny, not surprisingly, is not a happy one. Sonny does not become sunnier. But she endures, and she does so with grace, and she bears him 2 sons, as she would famously say, an heir and a spare. And the significance, by the way, of that cannot be overstated because she bore Sonny an heir, Blenheim Palace did not pass to Winston Churchill. And because it did not pass to Winston Churchill was, as a result, free to run for public office. So you can speculate about how human history would be different had Consuelo not done her part so spectacularly. But after 10 years of marriage to Sonny, she leaves him. And she does so with such grace and dignity that British society rallies around her and not her husband. And with the divorce comes a transformation. She had been trapped in Blenheim Palace before that, and now she is free. And she transforms herself into one of the most important philanthropists in all of England. She becomes an outspoken advocate on behalf of the disadvantaged. This shy, bookish girl from Manhattan becomes this powerful, charismatic social reformer. And in the spring of 1908, she returns to New York City, and she gives a very famous speech at the Waldorf Astoria. And it's to all of the assembled society women of New York. And she stands up and she gives them a tongue lashing. She doesn't mince words. She says, "You're wasting your life. Here you are with intelligence and resources and influence, and you squander it. You sit in the shadows and you let your husbands run everything. You should be out there asserting yourself on the front lines." And it's a speech that catches the imagination of the entire American public. It's written up in one newspaper after another. It's this famous address that forces women in America to sort of stand up and wonder what they have done with their lives. And as she's giving the speech, in the front row is her mother, Alva. And you can only imagine what effect it has on Alva. A decade before, she had sent her daughter off in tears, taking away from the man that she loved, because she felt that only by doing that could she save her daughter. And now her daughter has returned to New York, and she has been saved. And they talk afterwards, Alva and Consuelo backstage, and Consuelo turns to her mother and says, "You know, in spite of everything, I'm glad I married Sonny." And it's as if Alva has been granted absolution. A weight has been lifted off her shoulders. And she thinks about what her daughter has said, and she realizes that Consuelo was right, that she, Alva, has been too passive, that she, Alva, has stepped into the shadows when she should have stepped up into the spotlight. And she goes not long afterward to visit Consuelo in London, and while she's in London, she goes to a speech given by the famous English suffragette, Emmeline Pankhurst, at the Albert Hall. And women, of course, at the turn of the last century, did not have the vote almost anywhere in the Western world. And they were excluded entirely from the political process. And Emmeline Pankhurst and her band of militant followers were at the center of the fight for the vote in England. And they would break windows, and they would attack police officers, and they would burn down buildings. And Alva hears this, and she's just mesmerized. It's the greatest thing she's ever heard. And she can't imagine a more heroic figure than Emmeline Pankhurst. And she realizes, in fact, that what Consuelo was saying, Consuelo hadn't gone far enough. The issue wasn't just that women were too retiring. The issue was that women lived in a society that fundamentally did not treat them with legitimacy. And she realizes that every decision, painful decision she had to make over the course of her life, all had a common root. And that was that women were second-class citizens in the United States. And until women are given the right to vote, she realizes none of this transformation can happen. So she returns to New York, and she girds for battle. And she goes and looks at the state of the suffragette movement at that time, and she realizes it's in a mess. It's demoralized. The headquarters is off in some tiny little town in Iowa. It has no political clout whatsoever. The issue has been swept under the rug. And so Alva does the thing that she is best at doing, which is that she charges in and she takes over. And the first thing she does is she moves the headquarters back to New York, and she buys them a big fancy headquarters on Fifth Avenue. And then she takes her home in Newport, Rhode Island, and she turns it into a convention center for the suffragette movement. And they hold their meetings there, much to the dismay of all of her fancy neighbors. And she goes to Washington and she hires a lobbyist, which has never been done. And people denounce her and say, Alva, that's not ladylike to have a lobbyist. And Alva says, why would I care? I haven't been ladylike my entire life. And in 1909, the garment workers in New York go on strike, the female lady garment workers, and they are among the most oppressed of all workers in New York. And the picketers are illegally arrested by police, and the clothes are torn from their body, and they're assaulted in prison, and it's an outrage. And what does Alva do? Well, she leads a march down the Bowery on behalf of the striking garment workers. And she then has a fundraiser for them, hires a giant hall, and 7,000 people come. And then she goes to the police, to the court where the judge is presiding over their arrest. And she sits there all night long with one of her little beady eyes directed at the judge until he caves in and lets the strikers free. And then she turns her attention to African Americans. And African Americans have a suffragette movement in the same time. But of course, this is the early 20th century. And black people and white people don't mix. And Alva says, this is crazy. They're women too. And she invites black suffragettes to join the white suffragette movement. And when some women say, you're moving too fast, you're going to antagonize men, Alva says, men never worry about antagonizing men. Why should we? And throughout the long years of the First World War, many in the suffragette movement say, you know what, this is not a time for us to be pleading our case. We should step back and let this nation deal with this crisis. And Alva says, nonsense. This is precisely the time that we should be making our case to be treated as equal members of society. And she makes sure that throughout the First World War, every day there are picketers outside the White House advancing the cause of women's suffrage. She puts every ounce of her domineering, dictatorial, egotistical, manipulative, controlling personality into this cause. And of course, we know what happens. On August 18th, 1920, the 19th Amendment to the United States is passed, and women, for the first time in American history, are granted full rights as citizens. And the lesson of that victory applies as equally today as it did back then. And that is, if you deny people legitimacy, they will one day, by one means or another, rise up and defeat you. One last thing. Alva dies of a stroke in 1933, and her funeral is one of the most extraordinary events of that era. It's held in St. Thomas's Cathedral, the same place that Consuelo was married a generation before. And it's just like Consuelo's marriage. The people are lined up for blocks, and there are roadblocks, and every famous person in America shows up, and the cops are keeping everyone at bay, and every reporter is there to cover it. And her pallbearers are 50 of the most prominent feminists of the era. And in the service, the congregation sings 3 hymns. The first is a famous a hymn by Harriet Beecher Stowe, that great hero of the feminist movement. The second is the suffragette anthem, the March of the Women. And the third is a hymn written by Alva herself for this very occasion. And it is all about how when she gets to heaven, there is no way she's going to let a man like St. Peter stand in judgment of her. And it begins, no waiting at the gates of paradise, no tribunal of men to judge. The watchers of the tower proclaim, a daughter of the king. Thank you. I think I have. I think I have time for some questions. Is that right? Yeah. Let me put on my glasses so I can see people. Yes?
What became of her sons?
Her sons? They were layabouts and wastrels. The line peters out pretty quickly in the Vanderbilt clan. In fact, there are many Books written about the Vanderbilts. The best is one called, I think, just the Vanderbilts, which points out that in the mid-19th century, this was far and away, well, I think it was one of the richest families in the world. Unimaginable wealth. Within 100 years, it's essentially all gone. In fact, I once met Anderson Cooper, the CNN correspondent, who was, of course, a Vanderbilt. His mother is Gloria Vanderbilt, the great-granddaughter of Cornelius. And he would famously talk about how there was so little money in the family at this point that Cornelius Vanderbilt, the patriarch's grave, his crypt in Staten Island, is overgrown with weeds. And at family gatherings every year, there would always be these debates on who would pay for cleaning it up, and no one ever had enough money. So, yeah, it goes downhill fast.
I just wanted to ask, like when you were giving your speech, I couldn't help thinking about things that are going on in the world at the moment. You know, riots in London, Occupy Wall Street. Where do you think that anger and that frustration is headed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has I think that whenever you see social unrest, there are obviously multiple causes. So what I'm doing is I'm locating a kind of primary, principled cause of rebellion. So you have when you have a fundamental feeling of illegitimacy, and then you add to it all kinds of grievances, triggers, things, that's when you see these. So by no means can we use this framework to fully answer the question of why there are these patterns but I do think you can see similarities. I mean, where does Occupy come from? It comes from a feeling that in the wake of the financial crisis, that there was something fundamentally unfair and fundamentally disrespectful about the way blame was apportioned, the way bailouts were structured, the way, who was asked to shoulder the burden. There was a feeling that the system had a moment of fundamental illegitimacy, right? And they weren't wrong. I think, in retrospect, I don't think we would handle that crisis in precisely the same way today as we did then in certain areas. So I do think you can see in these sorts of, you can see echoes of these ideas over and again. But like I said, it's just the beginning of an explanation. You have to then sort of go into more detail.
So taking your Alva example, and I was just sitting here thinking about it, I thought, well, there were many Alvas out there. As you said, this was rife among New York wealthy society, and yet you did not have rebels. And so is that the source of that a lack of awareness, a lack of perceiving that you are living in illegitimacy? Or is that because I don't think all of those other wealthy women were making the calculation that rebelling was somehow the benefits of it were outweighing the costs. So,
well, you never get it. In all of these cases, you don't need to get everyone who is treated illegitimately and angry to rebel. You only need a small number to. I mean, Alva, all by herself and in concert with the existing suffragette movement, were able to do an awful lot, and by her example, was able to recruit others to her cause. Similarly, Martin Luther King. We forget. I have a chapter on Birmingham, Alabama, in my book, and what's fascinating about Birmingham, Alabama, of course, is that King arrives there for this climactic showdown with Bull Connor, the high watermark of the civil rights movement. He can't get anyone to march. He's getting a dozen people in the beginning of that movement to go out every night and march in protest against the racist policies of the city of Birmingham. So it's like you never, even in cases where there where there is a fundamental lack of legitimacy, you rarely get widespread rebellion. What you start with is just a small number who are able to channel their anger in some kind of productive way. And they then set the stage for others to join. So I think that's, if you think about it as a kind of a two-part or three-part process, with the Alvas as the...
Right. So there's something in those individuals that's
Yeah.
interesting to look at.
The combination of being really rich, really obstreperous, and really pissed off create, that doesn't happen a lot.
Sounds like she was born that way.
Yeah. Well, she wasn't born rich and she wasn't born angry, but she was born obstreperous. But, when you have a combination of those three things are rarely found in combination. We find obstreperousness and wealth in combination all the time, but rarely do we find pissed offedness in combination with those two other things. So she is an unusual character.
I just want to remind you that one of the sons of her was someone that she could be very proud of. He went down on the Titanic.
Oh, that's right.
Because he allowed the women to get off first. And
Yeah.
he was one of those that actually assisted all these women and children into the lifeboats. And
Yeah.
he stayed on and he went down.
Oh, that's right. I
So
forgot.
it was his brother, the Commodore, that became the heir to the fortune that was
Yeah.
still great at that time.
Yeah. A moment of, yes, of great chivalry.
I have a different interpretation of the Irish women. I mean, along with the anger, I think it's a calculated risk, because the only response that the British Army was prepared for is to fight. And the idea of this army firing on a group of unarmed women was certainly not going to be accepted by the rest of the world. However, if that army had other means of undermining them, I don't know if their anger would have been able to carry them through. I think it was a very calculated risk to face and confront them, and they were not going to be fired on.
Yeah. No, I think, I think you're absolutely, this was, the leader of the march is, and I've forgotten her name, one of the shrewdest insurgent minds in the Irish conflict. And she clearly knew what she was doing. And this was coming after the British had disgraced themselves over the course of the weekend in shooting in cold blood a number of innocent people in the Lower Falls. One, some guy goes out for an old guy goes out for a man in his 60s or 70s for a cigarette at 12 o'clock at night. And so there was a kind of a feeling the British already knew they had gone too far. And so I think that was part of the calculation of that moment. But I think you're absolutely right. This was not a kind of whimsical or rash act. It was a carefully calibrated act of rebellion by a very shrewd insurgent. What was that woman's name? She was then Bernadine Devlin, who was then was then shot in the eye by a Protestant militant. No, I shouldn't laugh, but I spent a good deal of time in Belfast when I was reporting that chapter, and it is the most deeply fascinating and weird insurgency that I have ever. I mean, I suppose they're all strange in their own way, but there is something about the Irish. There's one story which is not specific to the Troubles, but which gives you a flavor. So you go to Northern Ireland, you go to Belfast, and I hung out with all these ex-IRA guys. And of course, they're Irish, so they're all writing novels, right? Or some kind of... And so one of them told me the following story, which was, and all they want to do is to sit around and tell you long, incredibly detailed, absolutely hilarious stories. So there's this famous story of, in the 1940s, the IRA suspects that someone high up in their leadership, this is the original IRA, not the provisional IRA, that someone high up in their leadership is a British informer. So they kidnap him and they take him to a cottage up in the hills, off in the middle of nowhere. And they interrogate him at great length, and he confesses. He is, in fact, an informer. At which point it's agreed that he should write out his confession. He is kidnapped and taken to the cottage in April. He confesses shortly thereafter. In September, when he is finally rescued by the British, he is still writing out his confession. In other words, every day for like 4 months, he got up there and like, worked on his draft. And his captors, other IRA guys, were fine with that. In fact, there was nothing inconsistent about the insurgent culture of Northern Ireland that you would allow someone, whatever it took, to work on his literary masterpiece, in this case, his confession. But I don't know if there's ever been a case where you had an overlay between a kind of insurgency and a deeply literate culture. I imagine them tuning in to the BBC, to listen to something in the middle of the afternoon with their tea. I mean, it's just a kind of strange. Anyway, I could go on and tell stories about those guys for. Any other questions? Thank you very much.